Right. Let's now look at the book that you wrote, Bull in China. I've read the book. You're very positive right through. It's all good news, good news, good news. What's the cautionary tale on China that we need to take into account? You have very little of that.
Well, no, then I didn't do a very good job, because there's a lot of stuff in there about things that can go wrong in China and things that will go wrong in China.
I mean, the thing is that, well, you didn't work it into the sections, basically. Would you be more reflective if you were to write about China?
No, I explain all the things that can go wrong. And what I did is I then go into some of the industries in China, the things that are happening, agriculture, infrastructure, whatever. Explain some of the good things and some of the bad things, and then I explain, if you're interested in this industry, these are the companies. Okay. But it's only, it's a snippet about each company. It's 3 lines. It's just enough to say this is what the company does, and then if you reader, wants to do something, then you can, here's some companies you can start with. But I do say several times that some of these companies are going to go bankrupt, so don't just buy them because they're in this book. Buy them because you've done a lot of homework.
Right. And how much more homework needs to be done by someone looking at China after having read your book? You write about railroads, for example, and the countries which have taken railroads to the next level have a very strong or deeper capital market. They have bond markets. The local government has to issue bonds to be able to afford it, and so on. And China's not there yet in terms of the depth of the capital market. What is your cautionary tale in terms of?
Well, my cautionary tale on China is the same on any country. You've got to do an enormous amount of work. In that book, I may list a company and list 3 sentences. That's not enough to buy or sell the stock. You have to do a huge amount of work. If you're interested in railroads, then you need to look at all the railroads in China, the people who supply the railroads, the people who use the railroads. That's the only way you're going to figure out whether you should make investments in anything to do with railroads in China. And you probably should know about railroads in other countries too, as you point out. Some countries have much more developed railroad systems than others. So you need to understand what the possibilities for railroads are. So it's, again, any investment decision requires a huge amount of work if you're going to be a successful investor. Everybody loves to watch the television or read the periodicals about successful investing, and it always sounds so easy. It's never been easy for me. It has always required huge amounts of work, insight, judgment, and even lots of work. If you have bad judgment or bad insight, you still lose money, no matter how much work you do.
Right. If you wrote a book in the 1960s, you would have written something on Japan in a similar way. What are the corollaries between Japan and China in terms of what Japan went through in the 1970s and what China is going through today?
Well, if you'd written a book about Japan in the 1960s, you would have had 25 years of fantastic returns. You would probably own Japan right now, because if you'd sold at the right time, because you would have made so very, very, very much money. Now, if I'm right, China's going to be the same way, only it's going to go on for a century or so. China has natural resources. China has a huge population. Japan never had any natural resources. Does not have it has 125 million people, which is not so many. There's not so much space for 125 million people. So Japan had limiting factors, and always will. Any country does. China does have natural resources. China does have huge population. China does have an overseas community of overseas Chinese, which the Japanese did not. And China has Siberia, which is full of natural resources, full of breathing room, which as the country evolves over the next century, in my view, will be another area where they can expand peacefully for many reasons. So, yes, there are limitations on China, but in my view, China's got a long way to go. Japan had a great 25 years if you'd written your book in 1965. In my view, China's got 100 years to go before things collapse. And it could have 200, it could have 300. China's had many recurring periods of greatness in its history. It's had recurring periods of disaster as well. America's had what? America in the 19th century was an unmitigated disaster on the world scene. But the 20th century was great for America. The UK was pretty backwards in the 16th and 17th century, but in the 19th century they became a spectacular success. I would suspect that you could see 100 years in China. I mean, who knows? You can ask me in 100 years.
Some of the developments that were meant to be good for China, like the internet, like the movie industry, as you mentioned in your book, have brought up infrastructure issues, and the response of the local population to the internet has been something that the government hasn't been able to manage very well. Do you see issues in recent developments that make you concerned for China?
Well, there are going to be plenty of setbacks in China. In America in the 19th century, we had a horrible civil war. More people died in the American Civil War than have died in all of America's wars put together. It was that horrible. We had 15 depressions with a D. We had massacres in the streets with some regularity. We had virtually no human rights. We had very little rule of law. You could buy and sell. You can still buy and sell congressmen in America, but in the 19th century they were cheap. You could buy 3 or 4 in the 19th century. So America was a wreck. As recently as 1907, the entire American system went bankrupt. America was still a debtor nation until 1914. So America had many, many, many setbacks. The UK had many setbacks as it rose. China will too. There'll be some disasters. But in the end, America did a good job. I suspect that in the end, China will too.
Are you a bull on China at the expense of other economies or other civilizations that probably we need to take a look at as well, or who might be a dark horse coming?
Well, there's always somebody rising and there's always somebody declining. Is it cause and effect? Not necessarily. I mean, America has been the dominant country, as you know, just as the UK was the dominant country in the 19th century to be replaced by other countries. Was the UK's decline because of the rise of America? I don't know. That's an interesting subject for conversation. But China, somebody is going to be declining in the 21st century. There's no question about it. China's rise does not have to be a problem for other people. Countries could work together. Canada is a neighbor of the U.S. Canada became extremely prosperous and successful because they had a rich neighbor. Vietnam, Siberia, I mentioned before. I mean, many countries are going to be very successful as China rises. Throughout history, when you've had a country on the rise, that has usually led to clashes with somebody for whatever reason, whether it's an old dominant power facing the rise of a new one or not. It's always happened. I suspect it will happen again. It's not good news, but it's the way the world's worked for a few thousand years.